Is the Bible any different than any other ancient religious book? Is the Bible merely an interpretation of an interpolation of an oral tradition? Is the Bible anything more than just a convoluted mythology book? Well, the first place to start with the Bible is to actually read it, cover to cover, like a Grisham novel. The Bible's the best-selling book of all time. Therefore, many of us may want to read it for no other reason than intellectual curiosity. And the first thing you may realize is that the Bible is a history book. It's not a philosophy book. It's not some ethereal religious book. It reads like ancient history, complete with the famous civilizations, leaders, wars, battles, etc. Now, the second thing you might notice is that the Bible isn't just one book. It's actually 66 separate books written over approximately 1600 years by at least 40 distinct authors. The Old Testament contains 39 books written from approximately 1500 to 400 BC, and the New Testament contains 27 books written from approximately 45 to 95 AD. Okay, the Bible reads like a history book, but is it credible history? What about the fact that it's been handed down and reinterpreted over time? Well, many people are surprised to discover a common misunderstanding about interpretations and translations. Yes, the Bible's been translated from its original languages, but it hasn't been changed or interpreted along the way. The English translations we read today are actually derived from existing copies of ancient manuscripts in the original source languages. That's right, today's Bibles aren't translations of text translated from other interpretations. They go right back to the ancient source documents. The primary differences between today's Bible translations are merely related to how translators interpret a word or sentence from the original languages of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. This is no different than any other book we read in English that was translated from a different source language. Actually, when the Bible is compared to other ancient writings, it stands alone as the best preserved literary work of all time. Remarkably, there are thousands of existing Old Testament manuscripts and fragments copied throughout the Middle East, the Mediterranean, the European regions that agree phenomenally with each other. In addition, these texts substantially agree with the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, which was translated from Hebrew to Greek during the 3rd century BC. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in Israel in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s also provide astounding evidence for the reliability of the ancient transmission of the Old Testament in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries BC. The manuscript evidence for the New Testament is also dramatic, with nearly 25,000 ancient texts discovered in archives so far, at least 5,600 of which are copies and fragments in the original Greek. Some manuscript texts date to the early 2nd and 3rd centuries, with the time between the original autographs and our earliest existing fragment being a remarkably short 40 to 60 years. Now, this manuscript evidence far surpasses the manuscript reliability of other ancient writings that we trust as authentic every day. Look at these comparisons. Julius Caesar's The Gallic Wars, we have 10 manuscripts, with the earliest one dating to 1,000 years after he wrote the original. Pliny the Younger's Natural History, we have 7 manuscripts, with 750 years elapsed from the original. Herodotus, 8 manuscripts, 1,350 years elapsed. Plato, 7 manuscripts, 1,300 years elapsed from the original. And Tacitus, 20 manuscripts, with 1,000 years elapsed. Now, Homer's Iliad, the most renowned book of ancient Greece, is the second best preserved literary work of all antiquity, with 643 copies of manuscript support discovered to date. Now, in those copies, there are 764 disputed lines of text, as compared to 40 lines in all the New Testament manuscripts. The 643 copies of the Iliad pales in textual comparison with the over 5,600 copies and fragments of the New Testament in the original Greek, that together assure us that nothing's been lost. In fact, all of the New Testament, except 11 minor verses, can be reconstructed outside the Bible from the writings of the early church leaders in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. So the academic discipline of textual criticism assures us that the Bible translations we have today are essentially the same as the ancient manuscripts. So you have to remember that the Bible was hand-copied for hundreds of years before the invention of the first printing press in the mid-1400s. Nevertheless, the text is exceedingly well preserved. Now think about this again. Of the approximately 20,000 lines that make up the entire New Testament, only 40 lines are in question. These 40 lines represent 1/4% of the entire text and do not in any way affect the teaching and doctrine of the New Testament. Now again, compare this with Homer's Iliad. Of the approximately 15,600 lines that make up Homer's classic, 764 lines are in question. Now these 764 lines represent over 5% of the entire text, and yet nobody seems to question the general integrity of that ancient work. Take a look for yourself, you may be surprised. The Bible is better preserved by far than the other ancient works we've read and accepted over the years, such as Homer, Plato, Aristotle. The Bible hasn't been changed or interpreted from the ancient source texts. Simply as the Bible was carried from country to country, it was translated into languages that don't necessarily mirror the original languages of Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. Other than some grammatical and cultural differences, the Bible is absolutely true to its original form and content, and remarkably well preserved in its various translations. This is Randall Niles for AllAboutGod.com.